Sarah Mitchell had always been the type of person who trusted too easily. At 28, she worked as a nature photographer for outdoor magazines, spending most of her time capturing the raw beauty of untamed landscapes. Her camera was her companion, and mountains were her sanctuary. She never imagined that her love for adventure would lead her to the most terrifying experience of her life. The invitation came from her boyfriend Marcus, whom she had been dating for 8 months. He was charming, adventurous, and seemed to share her passion for the outdoors. When he suggested a hiking trip to Eagle's Summit, a remote peak in the Colorado Rockies, Sarah was immediately excited. The mountain was known for its challenging trails and breathtaking views, exactly the kind of place where she could capture stunning photographs for her upcoming article. Marcus had insisted they go with his friends, Jake, Tommy, and Derek. Sarah had met them only a few times before, but they seemed friendly enough. The plan was simple: drive up Friday evening, camp at the base, and tackle the summit on Saturday morning. It would be a weekend adventure that Sarah had been looking forward to for weeks. The drive to the mountain took longer than expected. The old logging road was rough and filled with potholes that made their pickup truck bounce violently. Sarah noticed that Marcus seemed more tense than usual, checking his phone frequently, even though there was no signal. His friends were unusually quiet, too, which struck her as odd since they were normally quite loud and boisterous. They reached the base camp just as the sun was setting behind the jagged peaks. The area was completely isolated. No other campers, no park rangers, just dense forest surrounding a small clearing. Sarah felt a slight unease but pushed it aside. After all, this was exactly the kind of remote location that would provide the best photographic opportunities. That night around the campfire, the men's behavior became increasingly strange. They spoke in hushed tones when they thought Sarah wasn't listening, and she caught fragments of conversation that made no sense to her. Words like deadline, payment, and no going back drifted across the flickering flames. When she asked Marcus what they were discussing, he quickly changed the subject and suggested they all get some sleep for the big climb ahead. Sarah lay in her sleeping bag that night feeling increasingly uncomfortable. Something was wrong, but she couldn't put her finger on what it was. The men were acting secretive, and Marcus seemed like a completely different person from the loving boyfriend she knew. She told herself she was being paranoid and tried to focus on the excitement of reaching the summit tomorrow. Morning came with a crisp mountain chill and crystal-clear skies. Sarah was relieved to see that the strange atmosphere from the previous night seemed to have lifted. The men were more talkative as they prepared their gear and ate breakfast. Marcus even gave her a kiss and told her how much he loved her, which eased her concerns considerably. The hike began well enough. The trail was steep and challenging. But Sarah was in excellent physical condition from years of outdoor adventures. She stopped frequently to take photographs, capturing the way morning light filtered through the pine trees and how mist clung to the distant valleys. Her camera clicked steadily as they climbed higher and higher. About 3 hours into the hike, they reached a narrow ledge that offered spectacular views of the surrounding wilderness. Sarah was setting up her tripod for some long exposure shots when she noticed the men had moved away from her. They were standing in a tight circle about 50 feet away, engaged in what appeared to be an intense discussion. Marcus suddenly turned and walked back toward her with an expression she had never seen before. His face was cold, almost emotionless, and there was something in his eyes that made her blood run cold. Jake, Tommy, and Derek followed behind him, their faces equally grim. "Sarah," Marcus said in a voice that sounded nothing like the man she thought she knew. "We need to talk." She stood up from her camera equipment, confused and increasingly frightened. "What's going on? You're all acting really strange." Marcus looked at his friends, then back at her. "The thing is, Sarah, this trip isn't what you think it is. We're not just here for hiking and photography." Sarah's heart began to pound. "What do you mean?" "Marcus, You're scaring me. We owe some people money, Jake said bluntly. A lot of money, and they gave us a way to pay it off. The blood drained from Sarah's face as she began to understand what was happening. What are you talking about? Derek stepped forward, pulling out his phone and showing her a photograph. It was a picture of her, taken without her knowledge, along with what appeared to be personal information, her address, her workplace, her daily routines. There are people who pay good money for certain services, Marcus said, his voice devoid of any emotion. People who are willing to pay extra for someone like you, young, attractive, isolated, with no one knowing exactly where you are. Sarah felt the world spinning around her. The man she had trusted, the man she had thought she loved, had brought her to this remote mountain to sell her to strangers. The betrayal was so complete and shocking that for a moment she couldn't even speak. "You're insane," she finally whispered. "Marcus, please, this isn't you. You can't be serious about this." "The buyers are meeting us at the summit," Tommy said matter-of-factly. "They'll be here in about 2 hours. We just need to get you up there and hand you over. Then our debt is cleared and everyone's happy." Sarah's photographer instincts kicked in, and she quickly calculated her surroundings. They were on a narrow ledge with steep drops on both sides. Behind her was a sheer rock face, and ahead was the only trail leading to the summit. The men had positioned themselves between her and the path down the mountain. "I won't go," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "You can't make me do this." Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Look around, Sarah. You're 3 miles up a mountain with no cell service and no way down except through us. You don't really have a choice here. Besides," Jake added, "if you cooperate, this will go easy for you. If you don't, well, these mountains are dangerous. Lots of accidents happen up here. People fall, get lost, never get found." The threat was clear. Sarah realized that her life was in immediate danger, and these men, including the person she had trusted most, were perfectly willing to hurt her to get what they wanted. Her mind raced as she tried to figure out a way to escape, but the geography worked completely against her. "I need a minute to think," she said, stalling for time while she desperately searched for any possible way out of this nightmare. "You've got 5 minutes," Marcus said. "Then we're moving to the summit whether you walk or we carry you." Sarah turned away from them, pretending to consider her options while actually scanning the rocky landscape for any possible escape route. The ledge they were on was part of a complex system of rock formations, and she noticed a series of smaller ledges and handholds leading around the side of the mountain. It would be incredibly dangerous, but it might be her only chance. She also remembered something she had read in one of her outdoor survival guides. Military personnel sometimes trained in these mountains. There was a possibility, however remote, that someone might be in the area. But she couldn't count on rescue. She had to find a way to save herself. "Time's up," Derek announced. "Let's move." Sarah knew this was her moment. If she was going to act, it had to be now, before they forced her higher up the mountain where escape would become even more impossible. She took a deep breath, said a silent prayer, and made the most desperate decision of her life. Instead of walking toward the summit trail as they expected, Sarah suddenly bolted toward the edge of the ledge. For a split second, the men were too surprised to react. She threw herself over the side, grabbing onto the rocky handhold she had spotted earlier. "She's jumping!" Tommy shouted. "Grab her!" But Sarah was already scrambling along the narrow ledges, moving as quickly as she dared while loose rocks scattered beneath her feet. She could hear the men shouting above her, but the complex rock formations made it difficult for them to follow her path. "You're crazy!" Marcus yelled down at her. "You'll fall and die!" Sarah didn't respond. She focused entirely on finding the next handhold, the next foothold, moving inch by inch along the treacherous rock face. Her photography work had given her good upper body strength and excellent balance, skills that were now literally saving her life. Behind her, she could hear the men arguing about what to do. They couldn't easily follow her route, and they couldn't shoot at her without risking attracting attention from anyone else who might be in the mountains. For the moment, she had bought herself some time, but she was far from safe. As Sarah continued her desperate escape along the mountain face, she had no idea that her ordeal was just beginning, or that help might come from the most unexpected source. High above in the thin mountain air, she was about to discover reserves of strength and determination she never knew she possessed. The mountain that was supposed to be her grave was about to become the place where she would fight for her life with everything she had. Sarah's hands were bleeding from gripping the sharp rocks, but she forced herself to keep moving. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest as she navigated the treacherous cliff face. Behind her, she could still hear Marcus and his friends shouting, their voices echoing off the mountain walls. They were trying to find another way down to reach her, but the complex rock formations were working in her favor. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, Sarah managed to reach a small cave hidden behind a curtain of hanging vines and fallen rocks. She squeezed inside, grateful for the shelter and the chance to catch her breath. Her whole body was shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion, but she knew she couldn't stay hidden for long. From her hiding spot, she could hear the men moving around above her, their voices growing more frustrated and angry. They were arguing among themselves, and she caught snippets of their conversation that made her blood run cold. "The buyers will be at the summit in an hour," Jake was saying. "If we don't show up with her, we're all dead." "She can't have gone far," Derek replied. "She's just some city photographer. She'll probably fall and kill herself anyway." "We need to find her body if that happens," Marcus said coldly. "We need proof that she's not going to cause problems later." Sarah pressed herself deeper into the cave, horrified by how casually they discussed her death. These were not the men she thought she knew. Marcus, in particular, seemed like a complete stranger, calculating, ruthless, and completely without conscience. She pulled out her camera and quickly checked the photos she had taken during their hike. In several shots, she had accidentally captured the men's faces clearly, along with some of their conversation when her camera's video mode had been running. If she could somehow get this evidence to the authorities, it might help protect other women from falling into the same trap. But first, she had to survive. Sarah knew she couldn't stay in the cave forever. The men would eventually find her, or she would die from exposure when night fell and the mountain temperature dropped below freezing. She needed a plan, and she needed to move soon. Carefully, she peered out of the cave opening and studied her surroundings. The cliff face continued down for several hundred feet, but she noticed something that made her heart leap with hope. Far below, almost hidden by trees and shadows, she could see what appeared to be a military training area. There were several small structures that looked like obstacle course equipment, and she thought she could make out camouflaged tents. If soldiers were training in the area, they might be her only chance for rescue. But reaching them would require her to continue the dangerous descent, and she would have to do it without alerting Marcus and his friends to where she was going. Sarah took off her bright red jacket and stuffed it into her backpack, leaving her in a dark green shirt that would blend better with the rocks and vegetation. She also grabbed her emergency whistle from her hiking kit and put it around her neck. If she could get close enough to the military camp, the whistle might help her attract attention. Taking a deep breath, she squeezed out of the cave and began the next phase of her descent. This part of the mountain was even more treacherous, with loose rocks and steep drops that made every step a potential disaster. She moved slowly and deliberately, testing each handhold before trusting it with her full weight. About halfway down, disaster struck. A large rock that seemed solid suddenly gave way under her foot, and she felt herself falling. For a terrifying moment, she thought this was the end, but her photographer's reflexes saved her life. As she fell, she managed to grab a small tree growing out of the cliff face, jerking to a painful stop that left her dangling over a 100-foot drop. The falling rock clattered loudly down the mountain, and Sarah heard shouts from above as Marcus and his friends realized where she was. She could hear them starting to make their way down a different route, trying to cut off her escape. Panic gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. Sarah pulled herself up using the small tree and continued her descent even faster, no longer caring about being careful. Rocks cut her hands and knees, and her muscles burned with exhaustion, but she pressed on. As she got closer to the bottom, she could see the military camp more clearly. It was definitely an active training site, with several soldiers visible moving between the structures. But they were still too far away to hear her if she called out, and she didn't want to risk alerting Marcus and his friends to her exact location. Sarah finally reached the bottom of the cliff just as the sun was beginning to set. Her body was battered and exhausted, but she was alive. The military camp was about a quarter-mile through dense forest, and she could see lights beginning to come on in the tents. She started making her way through the trees, moving as quietly as possible. Every snap of a twig made her freeze, listening for sounds of pursuit. She knew Marcus and his friends couldn't be far behind, and they would be desperate to find her before she could reach help. About halfway to the camp, Sarah heard voices behind her. The men had reached the bottom of the cliff and were spreading out to search for her. She could hear Marcus calling her name, his voice alternately pleading and threatening. "Sarah, please, just come back," he called out. "We can work this out. I never meant for things to go this far." She almost laughed at the absurdity of it. He had planned to sell her to human traffickers, but now he wanted to work things out. She kept moving toward the lights of the military camp, hoping she could reach them before the men found her trail. Just as she was beginning to think she might make it, she heard Derek's voice much closer than expected. "I found her tracks," he called out. "She's heading for those army guys." "We can't let her reach them," Jake replied. "If she talks, we're all going to prison." "Or worse," Marcus added grimly. "The buyers don't like loose ends." Sarah realized they were closing in on her position. In desperation, she pulled out her emergency whistle and blew it as hard as she could. The sharp, piercing sound echoed through the forest, and she immediately heard shouts from the military camp as soldiers responded to the distress signal. "There!" Tommy shouted. "She's right there!" Sarah saw flashlight beams cutting through the darkness as the men converged on her position. At the same time, she could see soldiers from the camp moving in her direction, their own lights sweeping the forest. For a moment, it was unclear who would reach her first. "Help me!" Sarah screamed at the top of her lungs. "I'm being kidnapped! Help me!" The soldiers immediately began moving faster, and she could hear them calling out to each other in military terminology she didn't understand. But Marcus and his friends were closer, and they were running toward her with obvious desperation. Marcus reached her first, grabbing her arm roughly and trying to drag her away from the approaching soldiers. "You stupid girl," he hissed. "You have no idea what you've done. These people will kill all of us now." "Let go of me!" Sarah screamed, struggling against his grip. The commotion attracted even more attention from the military camp. She could see at least 6 soldiers approaching rapidly, and their shouts indicated they understood this was a serious emergency situation. Jake and Tommy appeared on either side of Marcus, and for a moment Sarah thought they were going to try to overpower the soldiers. But as the military personnel got closer, she could see they were armed and clearly trained for combat situations. "Federal agents!" Derek suddenly shouted, though Sarah had no idea why he would say that. "These soldiers need to stand down!" It was obviously a desperate lie, but it created enough confusion to give Marcus one more chance to grab Sarah and try to drag her away into the darkness. That's when the first soldier reached them. "Release the woman immediately!" came a commanding voice from the darkness. "Military police! Everyone on the ground now!" Sarah felt Marcus's grip on her arm loosen slightly, and she took advantage of the moment to break free and run toward the soldiers. Behind her, she could hear the men arguing with the military personnel, their voices growing increasingly panicked. She stumbled into the arms of a female soldier who immediately began checking her for injuries while speaking rapidly into a radio. More soldiers surrounded the area, their weapons drawn and trained on Marcus and his friends. "Ma'am, are you injured?" the soldier asked. "Do you need medical attention?" "I'm okay," Sarah gasped. "But those men, they wanted to—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "We've got you now," the soldier said firmly. "You're safe. Can you tell me what happened here?" As Sarah began to explain her ordeal, she watched as the soldiers efficiently detained Marcus and his 3 friends. The men's plan had completely fallen apart, but Sarah knew her nightmare was far from over. There were still the mysterious buyers who had been expecting delivery of a kidnapped woman, and she had no idea how far this criminal network extended. What she didn't know was that her rescue was about to set in motion a much larger investigation that would uncover a trafficking ring spanning multiple states. The soldiers who had saved her were about to become her protectors in ways she couldn't imagine, and her ordeal on the mountain was just the beginning of a journey that would change her life forever. Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez had seen many things during her 12 years in the Army. But the terrified young woman who stumbled into their training camp that night would stay with her forever. Sarah Mitchell was covered in cuts and bruises, her clothes torn from her desperate climb down the mountain, but her eyes held a determination that impressed the veteran soldier immediately. The military camp Sarah had spotted was actually a specialized training facility for Army Rangers, where elite soldiers practiced mountain warfare and rescue operations. The timing of Sarah's escape couldn't have been better. The Rangers were specifically trained to handle exactly the kind of dangerous situation she had found herself in. After securing Marcus and his 3 accomplices, Sergeant Rodriguez sat with Sarah in the medical tent while a combat medic treated her injuries. Sarah's hands were severely cut from gripping the rocks during her descent, and she had multiple bruises and scratches, but nothing life-threatening. "Ma'am, I need you to tell me everything that happened," Rodriguez said gently. "We've detained the 4 men, but you mentioned there were supposed to be buyers meeting them at the summit." Sarah nodded, wincing as the medic cleaned a particularly deep cut on her palm. "Marcus said they would be there in 2 hours. That was—" She checked her watch. "About 3 hours ago now." Rodriguez immediately spoke into her radio, calling for backup units to check the summit area. Within minutes, a helicopter was dispatched to investigate, while ground teams began securing the entire mountain to prevent anyone from escaping. As Sarah continued her story, Rodriguez realized they had stumbled onto something much bigger than a simple kidnapping attempt. The level of planning involved, the remote location chosen for the exchange, and the casual way the men had discussed their criminal activities suggested this was part of an organized trafficking operation. "Sarah," Rodriguez said carefully, "do you have any idea how Marcus got involved in this? Had he ever done anything like this before?" Sarah shook her head. "I thought I knew him. We'd been dating for 8 months. And he seemed like a completely normal person. He never even mentioned owing money to anyone, let alone being involved in—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "Sometimes people we trust can surprise us in the worst ways," Rodriguez said. "But what you did tonight, escaping down that cliff face in the dark, that took incredible courage. You saved your own life." Meanwhile, other Rangers were interrogating Marcus and his friends in separate areas of the camp. The men's stories didn't match up, and it quickly became clear they were part of a larger network. Under pressure, Derek finally revealed that this wasn't their first operation. They had been recruiting vulnerable women for trafficking for over 2 years. The revelation made Rodriguez's blood run cold. How many other women had these men targeted? How many had not been lucky enough to escape? Captain James Mitchell, the commanding officer of the Ranger Unit, made the decision to expand the operation immediately. This was no longer just a rescue mission. It had become a major law enforcement operation that required coordination with federal agencies. "We're not equipped to handle a trafficking investigation," he told Rodriguez, "but we can damn well make sure these guys don't hurt anyone else while the FBI gets here." The helicopter team reported back from the summit with disturbing news. They had found evidence of a meeting that had taken place: tire tracks, cigarette butts, and most chilling of all, restraints that had obviously been intended for Sarah. The buyers had waited for the delivery, and when it didn't happen, they had fled. But the Rangers weren't about to let them get away. Using night vision equipment and tracking skills honed through years of military operations, teams of Rangers began following the tire tracks down the mountain. The traffickers had taken a different route than the one Sarah's group had used, but they hadn't counted on being pursued by some of the most highly trained soldiers in the world. Sarah watched from the medical tent as Rangers prepared for what was essentially a combat mission on American soil. She felt a mixture of gratitude and amazement as these soldiers, who had been conducting routine training exercises just hours earlier, dropped everything to hunt down the people who had planned to destroy her life. "They don't have to do this," she said to Rodriguez. "I mean, they've already saved me. The local police could handle the rest." Rodriguez smiled grimly. "Ma'am, with respect, you don't understand how Rangers think. These men planned to hurt an innocent woman on our mountain during our training exercise. That makes it personal for every soldier in this unit." About 2 hours later, the pursuing Rangers made contact with the fleeing traffickers. The criminals had gotten their vehicle stuck trying to navigate a particularly difficult section of the mountain road, and they were attempting to continue on foot when the Rangers caught up with them. Unlike Marcus and his friends, these men were armed and dangerous. They immediately opened fire when they realized they were being pursued, turning a rescue operation into a firefight in the middle of the Colorado wilderness. The Rangers, however, were professionals who had trained for exactly this type of situation. Using coordinated tactics and superior equipment, they quickly surrounded the traffickers and forced them to surrender. No one was killed, but 2 of the criminals were wounded and would require medical attention. Back at the base camp, Sarah listened to the radio chatter as the operation unfolded. She couldn't believe that all of this was happening because of her escape from what should have been a simple hiking trip. "How many people were involved in this?" she asked Rodriguez. "We've detained 7 suspects so far," Rodriguez replied, "but the FBI team that's flying in tonight will be able to tell us more about the scope of the operation." As dawn broke over the mountains, Sarah found herself surrounded by a small army of federal agents, military personnel, and local law enforcement officers. Her simple camera, which she had managed to hold onto during her desperate escape, contained evidence that would help convict multiple traffickers and potentially save dozens of other potential victims. Agent Patricia Williams from the FBI sat down with Sarah as the sun rose, explaining what would happen next. "Ms. Mitchell, I want you to know that your courage in escaping and reaching these soldiers has broken open one of the largest human trafficking operations we've been investigating in this region," Williams said. "The evidence you captured on your camera, combined with what we're learning from the suspects, is going to put a lot of dangerous people in prison for a very long time." Sarah learned that Marcus had been recruited into the trafficking ring after accumulating gambling debts he couldn't pay. Rather than face the consequences of his poor choices, he had agreed to help target vulnerable women who could be sold to buyers across the country. Sarah had been specifically chosen because of her job as a freelance photographer, which required her to travel to remote locations where disappearances might not be immediately investigated. "How many other women?" Sarah began, but couldn't finish the question. "We're still investigating," Williams said gently. "But we believe your escape may have prevented at least a dozen other planned kidnappings. These people had a whole system worked out. And you disrupted it completely." The Rangers who had saved Sarah's life became something of a legend within military circles. Their quick thinking and decisive action had not only rescued an innocent woman, but had also dismantled a major criminal enterprise. Several of them received commendations for their actions that night. Sarah kept in touch with Sergeant Rodriguez and several of the other Rangers who had saved her life. She learned that they had specifically requested to be involved in the follow-up investigations, wanting to make sure that everyone involved in the trafficking ring was brought to justice. The legal proceedings took almost 2 years to complete. Marcus and his 3 friends all received lengthy prison sentences, as did the buyers who had been caught fleeing down the mountain. The FBI investigation uncovered a network spanning multiple states, leading to dozens of additional arrests. Throughout the trial process, Sarah had to relive the events of that terrible night many times. But she also got to see the Rangers who had saved her testify about their actions, and she was struck by their continued commitment to protecting innocent people, even when their military duties didn't require it. "You didn't have to chase those people down the mountain," she said to Rodriguez during a break in one of the trials. "You had already saved me." "Ma'am," Rodriguez replied, "Rangers don't leave jobs half-finished. Those people plan to hurt you and others like you. Our mission isn't complete until people like that are stopped permanently." Sarah eventually returned to her career as a nature photographer, but her experience on Eagle's Summit changed her in profound ways. She became an advocate for human trafficking victims, using her photography skills to document the stories of other survivors and raise awareness about the ongoing problem. She also never forgot the lesson she learned about trust and betrayal. The man she had thought she loved had been willing to sell her into slavery to pay his debts. But strangers, soldiers she had never met, had risked their lives to save her simply because it was the right thing to do. Years later, Sarah would still wake up sometimes from nightmares about that night on the mountain. But she also remembered the sound of helicopters coming to her rescue, the firm voice of Sergeant Rodriguez telling her she was safe, and the sight of Rangers disappearing into the darkness to hunt down the people who had planned to destroy her life. The mountain that was supposed to be her grave had instead become the place where she learned that evil exists in the world, but so does extraordinary goodness. And sometimes, when courage meets preparedness and determination, even the most desperate situations can have endings that restore faith in humanity. The trafficking ring was completely dismantled, its leaders serving life sentences in federal prison. Sarah's camera, which had captured crucial evidence, was eventually returned to her by the FBI. She kept it as a reminder of the night when her love of photography and her will to survive had combined to save not just her own life, but the lives of countless other potential victims. She never went hiking alone again, but she also never stopped believing in the power of ordinary people to do extraordinary things when faced with evil. The Rangers had shown her what real heroism looked like, and their example inspired her to spend the rest of her life helping other survivors find their own strength and courage.